This is Sharon Israel, the host of Planet Poet Words in Space. And so happy you can join me this Tuesday at 1 p.m. And I'd like to read to you 2 lines of poetry to start. All night, the ravens release a black crying, as if they held worlds we can never touch. And those lines are by my guest, calling all the way from California, poet Maxima Kahn. Hi, Maxima.
Hi.
Hi, Maxima. Let me read your bio. And okay. And those lines of poetry are so beautiful. Maxima Kahn lives in the Sierra Nevada in California. Her debut full-length collection of poems, Fierce Aria, was released by Finishing Line Press in May 2020. Her poetry and essays have appeared in the Louisville Review, the Los Angeles Review, Wisconsin Review, Spillway and Sweet, among many others. She has received fellowships and scholarships to the Vermont Studio Center and the Community of Writers. Having taught at the University of California, Davis Extension, she now teaches and blogs at brilliantplayground.com. Hi, Maxima. So glad you can join us today.
Thank you so much for having me. What a delight to be on your show.
Oh, thank you. And we'll start. I read the lines from your poem, Winter. Would you read the whole poem for us, please?
I'd be happy to. Winter. All night the ravens release a black crying, as if they held worlds we can never touch. It's the woods where the breathing moves, where night, well, you know, at some point you have to come back to your own house. All the spells of the others, you have to leave them. Even the apple the old witch gave. You're not going to wake up to salvation. You know that by now. But inside, where the cupboards are filled with the familiar, where loneliness languishes in narrow beds, here there is something you can build with. There isn't any choice about where to start. Always the beginning, small and limited as it seems. One rose in a cup, the mouse gnawing the cereal, laundry muttering in a basket. After that, I can't say. The woods are dark. Here is the gate, and my own amazement cries me to sleep.
That's Maxima Kahn reading her poem, Winter. Maxima, I love one rose in a cup, the mouse gnawing the cereal, laundry muttering in a basket. You go from very large to very, very small. I really think it's beautiful.
Thank you.
Why was this is the opening poem of your collection, Fierce Aria. Would you tell us why you chose that poem to open?
Sure, yes. In the most prosaic sense, which is the lesser reason, I often would open readings with this poem for many years, and it just felt like a good opening. But when I started to really look at assembling the collection, and that was a process that took quite a long time, I realized that it really was a good opening to the collection because it's very much a spell-casting poem. It's sort of a magical language kind of poem, and it's every poem is that, but this one is particularly so, and it's sort of inviting me or the speaker of these poems into an acceptance of my own self and my own gift and what it's possible to do with poetry. So yeah, there's a lot of themes that are important to the book, and also sort of, I hope, invite the reader into the book.
Oh, that's great. What do you mean by casting a spell poem? I find that fascinating. It's beyond the lyric, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like words and poems, they are magical spells in a way. I'm very intrigued by this idea that the word spell means literally to spell the letters of a word and to cast a spell. And I think that that's what poetry always is attempting to do in some way. But this one with this sort of evocative, dreamy language, all night the ravens release a black crying, is sort of inviting us into that alternate reality, so to speak, that I think certainly my poems are trying to reach, and I'm trying to reach in my life, and I write about that longing to sort of reach this realm of wonder and beauty and spirit a lot in my poems.
Yeah, I think you give us a beautiful door into that from the very beginning of the poem. And the poem is in the first section of the book, Andante Cantabile. Would you explain that phrase for us?
Sure, yeah. The book is called Fierce Aria, and it's divided in three what I call musical movements, much like a classical piece of music would be. Even though an aria, in fact, in an opera is not divided in movements, it often is in either a two-part or three-part form. And so the sections of the book have musical indications for them, and the first one, as you said, is Andante Cantabile, which means at a walking pace, singingly, and it is an indication you can find on classical works if you type that in.
Right. I love it. You're a musician, you're a violinist, you study composition, so you bring a lot of richness and intuitiveness to your work. Can you tell us the difference in mood between each section as we reach it?
Sure, yeah. So Andante Cantabile, this walking pace singingly, I think of it as kind of the earthiest section of the poem, and it is, of course, of the book, and it is the entry point of the book, and it's kind of grappling with a lot of questions of life, living. I mean, the whole book does, but I feel like it's in some ways, as I say, the kind of more sensuous, earthy section. The second section, Adagio Mesto, literally means slow and sad, and often the second movement of a classical piece will be the slow, sad movement. And it has more poems of grieving, of loss, of sorrow in it, and some trying to come to peace with that sorrow. And the final section, Allegro Grazioso, means lively and with grace. And I was thinking of sort of the double meaning of grace as also, not only graceful, but referring to spirit. And it does contain the most spiritual poems in the book are in the third section, and there are more poems of peace and acceptance in that section. The whole book has a kind of narrative arc behind it of grappling with the challenges of life and the challenges of being an artist in the world and trying to come to some greater sort of peace and acceptance.
Well, that's very helpful, and that's how you live your life too. Your blog and the way you live your life, as I said, inspires your poetry, and I guess it's very circular. One feeds the other. I love the title, Fierce Aria. Did you have the title in mind before you wrote the book, or compiled the poems for the book, or after?
No, I did not. I mean, the original title of the book at its very beginning, but the first version of the book it was completely different from this, and only had maybe a quarter of the poems that are in this book. The very first version was called Meditations on Desire. When I finally got to this version of the book, I was really stumped for a title. Titles are hard for me in general. I really struggle with them, and I started hunting through the poems in the manuscript, kind of looking for a title, and the title of the book does in fact come from line in the second poem of the book. And when I hit on that, I realized it was absolutely perfect, sort of for the book. And as many people who know me have said, it kind of sums me up as well.
Yeah, it's a wonderful title. I think titling a book of poems is very difficult. If you don't find it difficult, I think there's a little problem there. It needs a lot of thought, but maybe it wells up after the process has been ongoing for a while. But Maxima, would you read a poem from the second section of Adagio Mesto from Fierce Aria for us?
Sure, I'd be happy to. One other thing I was just going to say about the title, especially for people who are engaged in the act of making their own books and poetry, is that once I landed on the title, I also then looked back and revised the book and the ordering and selection a bit to make sure it really met the expectations of that title, that it both be fierce and full of music. And I feel like that's a good kind of lens to look through at your own work if you're assembling a collection.
That's very, very helpful advice for poets. And I like that everything comes from the unconscious, I guess, the title, the poems. But then when things become conscious, you can use that as a tool to help the other work. And sort of the title creates its own spell, if you would, on the work itself.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So now.
Yes. All right. So yes, you asked for a poem from the second section.
Yes.
So I'm going to read California Fall.
Wonderful.
California Fall. Late October in the garden, crocuses push up through the leaf fall. Everything's confused here. It's California, caught in weird autumnal thrall. Like a page thumbed open to weathers, wrinkled and rain-soaked, California's flighty liturgy of the unreal tips westward into the sea. Here in the low Sierra, camellias mingle with the flash and flame of migrant maples, old emblems planted by homesick pioneers hungry for a different gold. What is it we gather to ourselves, wanting to bloom even as the dying begins, as the season yearns for completion? What is it unravels as the new raveling starts? There's no summation in California. We tremble at the tip but never fall. We linger too long and lose our scope and drift into the endless sea, headlong into the west.
That's Maxima Kahn reading her poem, California Fall, from her debut poetry collection, Fierce Aria. That is so evocative. I love the California's flighty liturgy of the unreal tips westward into the sea. But the last stanza, there's no summation in California. Could you read that whole stanza again and talk a little bit about it, Maxima?
Sure.
Thank you.
There's no summation in California. We tremble at the tip but never fall. We linger too long and lose our scope and drift into the endless sea, headlong into the west. So I am a East Coast native. I was born and raised in Boston, and I went to college in Vermont before I began my westward expansion in my 20s. And so, you can take the girl out of New England, but you can't take the New England out of the girl. So there's this poem is really my New England bred self kind of looking at California, even though I've lived here for decades. And for me, it's both what I love about California is this sense of openness. I felt a tremendous freedom moving west and moving away from the kind of heavy weight of tradition and a certain kind of this is how we do things on the East Coast, and a kind of what felt much more competitive energy, out to the West, where it felt very welcoming and, as I say, open-ended and experimental. A lot of great experimentation in the arts comes out of the West, out of California. And so there was this sense of freedom, but also a kind of unnerving unboundedness in some ways, and a sense of California's flighty liturgy of the unreal, that some of that experimentation gets pretty wild, especially as we know in the past, in the 60s and 70s and all that. So, and that history, I feel like, is still very much alive here. So that's kind of what I was pointing to.
And I love the crocuses push up through the leaf fall. Of course, coming from the East Coast, that's very odd.
Yes.
The camellias mingle with the flash and flame of migrant maples. So that poem says it fits beautifully into the theme of the book, and it captures the tone of this section of the Adagio Mesto. Could you say just briefly about that, how it fits in this section?
Yeah, as I said, the second section is a lot about grief and loss of various kinds and sorrow. And so, autumn, of course, is the season of that, of letting go and loss and shedding. And so in that sense, it is very much a part of that. And the second to last stanza, what is it we gather to ourselves, wanting to bloom, even as the dying begins, as the season yearns for completion. We of course we're always wanting to bloom and to feel like this eternal springtime, but in fact we go through these seasons of loss and letting go, and that's very much what the second section of the book addresses.
And the genesis of the book, the manuscript took you a while to compile and to complete, as you had started talking about. Just briefly touch on the importance of work in conquering the book and creating the book.
Sure, yeah. This manuscript this book took 10 years to birth, and as I say, the first version of the manuscript looked nothing like this one. I went through 4 completely different versions before arriving at this one, and then something like 11 revisions of this manuscript. So it was a long labor. In there somewhere in those 10 years, there were a few years where I just stepped away from it completely and then came back, and there were periods of time where I stepped away at other times. But it really was about kind of hanging in there and learning what does it take to assemble a book of poems? What is a book of poems? Like, what is it meant to do? It's not just a random assortment of your favorite poems. Exactly. How do they need to speak to each other? How do you build a book? Along the way, I hired various editors to help me, either with individual poems and then eventually with the manuscript as a whole, and that was enormously helpful to get some outside eyes and ears.
Sure. And, well, you did a great job. I mean, it's a beautiful book. And Annie Finch, who reviewed your book, has comments on the back cover, said, to coax the still perfection of ideas out of the abstract realm so they can take shape in the messy wilderness of reality. And that's what she wrote about your book and your poems, which I think is beautiful. And in light of this, would you read The Language of Clouds for us, Maxima?
I'd be happy to. So The Language of Clouds comes from the first section of the book, and it's a poem I wrote way back in 2001 when I was spending a month as a visiting artist at the Vermont Studio Center in northern Vermont, and which was a wonderfully fertile time for me. And I came across in the library there a dictionary of clouds, or an encyclopedia of clouds, which had these incredible photographs, just breathtaking photographs of cloud formations, and equally breathtaking to me, the language used to describe clouds. And I was so struck by this, and it ties into a persistent theme of mine in my writing, which is sort of how are we shaped by the language that we use? How are we limited by it, in what we can express, and also opened by it? And so that's where this poem, The Language of Clouds, came from.
Thank you. Wonderful.
The language of clouds. The sky writes large with a brilliant hand, wave and anvil, impending horizon, clouds stack up like plates, white china waiting to fall, the gods' pellucid writing in the advancing squall. While down on earth we stumble in the fog, our gestures hardly able to articulate such light. Wan palette spinning over grayed canvas, threadbare desire, tired old wants, our words a muttered air, trailing off before the ends, mute icons toward something we don't understand. Captured ice hangs in the atmosphere, striking us dumb. Cirrus streaks across the sky, nimbus laden with rain, cumulus paving cloud streets the angels might ride down. We have no vocabulary to compare with these dialects of illumination. Black waves swallow mountains whole, rewrite the known in vast billows on which we read signs. If I could appropriate the language of clouds, tune its cold mastery to my mouth, draw my images in inverted air with noctilucent lines, spread myself across the sky in manic hues, peach blossom, gunmetal, mauve, and turquoise, and always be erasing, like the Tibetan sand masters, building grain by grain elaborate mandalas to be emptied in the river's flow. If I could speak in stacked plumes, mock suns, and errant holes in the sky, if these distortions were my speech, the scud and pileus, who would I be? How does my language write me?
That's Maxima Kahn reading her beautiful poem, The Language of Clouds. So many beautiful things in that, so many beautiful lines in that poem. If I could appropriate the language of clouds, tune its cold mastery to my mouth. And that's what you're saying, how language is shaped by, how we are shaped by language. And tune its cold, could you talk briefly about that line and about the poem again? It's
Yes. Yeah, so, as I say, like, if I could appropriate the language of clouds, tune its cold mastery to my mouth, and then sort of jumping ahead to the end of that very long question sentence, who would I be?
Who would you be?
You know, how does my language write me? If I were speaking literally in the language of clouds with these big, fluffy swirls in the sky rather than words, you know, how would that shape me differently than being a poet writing in English? You know, one of the things I'm interested in about language is that different languages have words that, for concepts that if you don't have that word, you really have no way of conceiving of that. So, like the word dharma, you know, from Sanskrit, until that word actually came into the English language somewhat, we really had no concept for that. You know, it's a very complex concept. German has no real word for privacy. I find that very interesting.
Yes, it is.
Right? So, you know, as a poet, words are my medium, like paint is to a painter, and so I have to really look at that medium and what does it make possible and what does it not make possible. And that is a good part of what this poem is grappling with.
And also succeeding with, because it's a real tour de force. I mean, you show us in this poem what your words can do. So you belie the elusiveness of communication through words with this beautiful poem. Thank you, Maxima. And now our poet at large, Pamela Monshe Pierce, will be joining us to bring us the latest in poetry news. There we go. Poetry news and insights. And Pushcart Prize nominated poet Pamela Monshe Pierce is currently taking workshops with performance artist and writer Karen Finley at the Hudson Valley Writers Center. And that was Pamela Monshe Pierce's new theme for Poet at Large. Hi, Pamela.
Hello, Sharon. Hello, Maxima.
Hello.
Hi. I'm so happy to be here today, and Maxima, you put a spell on me. I'm really enjoying your work so much, and I have to tell this. When you said mentioned the language of clouds, I love clouds, and I am a member of the Cloud Appreciation Society.
You are?
It is an organization. It could only be in Britain. There's no other place in the world.
Oh, I love it. Oh.
And I pay a yearly, very modest fee, and every morning I get a gorgeous photograph that another member has taken of clouds with some text. And it could be poetry, it could be an observation, it could be whatever. It is absolutely delightful. So I urge everybody to go to become a member of the Cloud Appreciation Society.
Oh my God! How utterly marvelous!
It's wonderful. It's wonderful. So on that note, I'm going to begin what my portion, and what I want to talk about today is what I think is newsworthy, certainly for me right now, is that I have revived a group that I began in 2010 called Poets Read Poetry. I began that when I lived in Garrison. I was living in a kind of an isolated way. I was living alone in that place, and it was after my husband died. And I felt a need for poetry and to be stimulated by some good brains. So I gathered 3 poets from the area, and we met once a month to read and discuss the work of other poets. Not our own work, but the work of other poets. I felt a similar kind of isolation over the past year when I basically have been alone in my New York City apartment for a year now, and I brought the band back together. So we're working together. We're meeting once a month, and it's very exciting. I've often mentioned on this show when I'm on practically every month that I think one of the great things about Planet Poet is it focuses on reading poetry rather than creating it. And people all over the place, we're all creating poetry now. There are workshops everywhere. Every day I get another offer to be in a poetry workshop. And so I love it that reading poetry is another aspect of writing poetry. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened this last Saturday night. Our theme was finding a poet that was new to us. It may not be a new poet, but is a poet who is new to us. And the sub-theme was love. The variety of 4 people going at this theme was pretty incredible. Louis MacNeice came up. He was the darling of the 1930s Auden Spender Day-Lewis group in 1930s London. A 13th century Sephardic poet, Abraham Abu Afia, came up, and he wrote a love poem to God. An American contemporary woman named Jessica Jacobs wrote a romantic poem in the grove of self-charging trees. And Timothy Donnelly, a contemporary American poet, his poem, The New Intelligence, was brought up. So the variety was pretty incredible. And I'm going to read excerpts from 2 of the poems, so different, so different. but both about love. This one is Rabbi Abraham Abulafia. He's a Sephardic writer in 13th century, born in 13th century Spain, and he's writing this love poem to God. And Jehovah spoke to me when I saw his name spelled out and merged with the blood in my heart, separating blood from ink and ink from blood. And Jehovah said to me, behold, blood is the name of your soul, and ink the name of your spirit. Your father and mother are vessels for my name and a sign. And then I fathomed the tremendous difference between my spirit and soul, and a great joy came through me, for I knew my soul was dwelling in the redness as blood, and my spirit was dwelling in the blackness as ink. Now, for something completely different.
Wow.
Isn't it amazing? It's unbelievable. And here is Jessica Jacobs, contemporary woman living in North Carolina, and this is an excerpt from her poem, In the Grove of Self-Charging Trees. Yet, beside the bed, the marigolds you brought me burn like paper, caught in the act of ignition, orange and red, petals of flame. And on each of our ring fingers, the same silver band, my promise to you, my charge, that through the forest and the fog, through the busy thicket of daily brambles, I will never stop finding my way to your door. All I need from you is to answer. All you have to do is let me in. Mm-hmm. Now, for me, it doesn't get more romantic than that. I mean, that's really committed and passionate and just beautiful way of expressing romantic love. So this is the kind of thing that can happen if you put a group like this together. And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give you the headlines about how you can put a group of a poetry group. That's the name of it. You can put it together. You choose 3 other people whose thinking you like, and you find a place to meet once a month. You pick a place, of course, where you're not going to be interfered, private place where you can not be interfered with other people. And you pick a day of the week and a 2-hour time slot that's convenient for all. You pick a simple but interesting theme, such as poems written in the year you were born, poems about food, poems about a place you love, and each member would brings in copies of the poem, or with Zoom, since we're doing this on Zoom, and send them to the rest of the group in advance. The reader then reads the poem aloud, and the group discusses it for 15 or 20 minutes. And then at the end, an important feature of this group, and everybody loves this, is that we do something that is called shop talk. So it gives the group members an opportunity at the end of the session to discuss what is happening in their writing lives, successes, failures, need for support or suggestions, or something that they're reading or something that has come their way that might be of interest to the rest of the group. So this is what every month Sharon asks me to do something that I think is newsworthy, and I think this is newsworthy, and I think it's really an exciting concept for everyone to put to use while we're still being isolated, and we can't really all get together in the way that we did before, or the way we'd like to. So that's what I'm suggesting.
That's wonderful, because also there's not the pressure of a workshop.
Right.
That you have to present your work and worry about it or whatever. It's just very relaxed. And I was so impressed by the poems you picked, because they're so beautiful by themselves, but they really reflect Maxima's work also, which I thought was really beautiful.
They do. They do, and it's amazing when you throw out a theme and people just pick something. It's the same thing in a writing workshop, which we've all been in, where somebody says, write about this chair. And if there are 15 people, it becomes 15 different chairs. Mm-hmm. And with this, everybody has a different take on what the theme is, or, their own take on the theme, and doing their own research to come up with a poem. The variety is very exciting, and the discussions are also very exciting. And I know for myself, especially right now with lockdown, I really miss that kind of intellectual stimulation of being at a dinner party with people.
Mm-hmm.
Being at a cocktail party and breaking off into a little group. So this really is I'm finding this very satisfying, and I hope that by my discussing this today that I can inspire some of your listeners to give it a try. And it doesn't even have to be all poets. It can be, it could be just regular, people who love poetry and who want to be active with it. And so there's a lot of possibilities.
Thank you, Pamela. That's fantastic. A real poet at large experience with your membership in the Cloud Society and bringing us poets reading poetry.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Enjoy the clouds, and I'm going to sit back now and I'm going to enjoy Maxima's poetry. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Pamela.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yes, I love that idea of the poets read, or anyone reads poetry group, and that's wonderful.
Yeah, it's and for poets and non-poets alike, as Pamela was saying. And Maxima, I just love the reflection of the theme and in your work too. And would you read for us? We time is fleeing, unfortunately, but your next poem from the third section, You Have Permission?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Yes. You have permission to want beauty, to press it into the bone, to gather in the storm howling into the wind, to want manna and a heaven to shelter us, to long for the warm tide of arms, to believe in the broken bones mended, to cast in stone and bronze. To know you are separate in the same breath one, how fragile the illusion of the body is. To dance inside your clothes, you can't help it. We are strung beads on God's necklace, learning a new old language of love. No matter how you stumble over your feet, over forms, there's a deeper freedom, a stronger grace. If you look up in the sky, do it now. Birds, clouds, moon, or inside your own hollow body. You will know what I mean and come running into this vast embrace.
That's lovely. That's Maxima Kahn reading her poem, You Have Permission, from her debut poetry collection, Fierce Aria. It's really about writing poetry too, right? No matter how you stumble over your feet over forms.
Yeah.
You're referring to forms. I love when you say you are strung beads on God's necklace. And I think I've heard the crown sonnets, series of crown sonnets, referred to as beads on a necklace. 14 crown sonnets. But that could be of any choice of poem. And this is a very philosophical poem without being overly intellectualized. It's very visceral. You have a very visceral philosophy, and I must touch on your family background because I think you come by it as part of your heritage. If you would like to talk about your parents for a minute.
Sure. Yes. Both my parents were philosophers, philosophy professors, and my father, Hilary Putnam, taught at Harvard, and my mother, Rosanna Putnam, taught at Wellesley College. And so I was immersed in poetry, in philosophy from birth, and it was, very much in the air I breathed, and that's a challenging thing, actually, for a child, because the very nature of reality was constantly being questioned in my household, which is pretty disorienting when you're quite young. I claim that when I was 5 years old, and probably I was actually a little older, but my father asked me, how do you know that you're not just dreaming?
Oh, dear.
So, that's a little distressing when you're little to make sense of. But at the same time, my poems are deeply philosophical. They're very much infused with this lifelong habit of questioning. the nature of life and what are we here to do and how do we make a meaningful life. So I owe a great debt to my parents, and the book is, in fact, dedicated to them.
Yes.
It was quite sad for me that they passed before the book was published.
Oh, dear. Yeah, I'm sorry. What you said reminded me of something I read about Uma Thurman, whose father was Robert Thurman. He was a very prominent Buddhist philosopher, theologist. Yeah. And she really couldn't cope with the fact that he talked about just like you said, the impermanence of things all the time, which is the children need boundaries and they need solidity, and they need the illusion of comfort and stability, whether it's true or not.
Right.
So that's hard for a child. That's hard for a child to take. But everything has two sides to it.
Yes.
So
very much so.
And I think does that in when you say in your poem to believe in the broken bones mended, is that what you mean about that and about writing in general? Because I know you have a teaching philosophy that's in line with this. If you would discuss that a little, please.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you have permission very much. I, as a teacher, I teach people. I teach creative writing. I teach the artist's way. So I'm basically teaching people how to get unblocked and release their creativity, their natural creativity. And so I feel like my number one job as a teacher is giving permission, and it is my number one teaching style is sort of permission and encouragement, which goes a long, long way towards bringing out the best in people. And so this poem very much comes out of that impulse that is in my blood at this point to grant permission. And really this is the poem is granting permission to anyone to love what you love, to create what you create, to believe in it. And in terms of that line you brought up, to believe in the broken bones mended, is to believe in the possibility of healing, because in my work, because I'm working a lot with people who somewhere along the way have gotten wounded in their creativity and shut down in some way, my teaching work goes very deeply into healing and transformation, and the possibility that, which I have seen many, many times in my own work, that we really can heal from very deep wounds and transform. So that's really what that line points to. Thank you.
You also talk about, I've read some of your entries of the brilliantplayground.com, which is your blog, and you want to say a few words about that, but you talk about the concept of deep play, which is really in line with what you've just been saying.
Yes, yeah. So, the home of my teaching work on the web, and where I also blog about what I call artful, soulful living, is brilliantplayground.com. And this concept, deep play, which I speak about in my work, I talk about helping people to live lives of passion, purpose, and deep play. The term deep play comes from Diane Ackerman's book of the same name, Deep Play, and that's where I first encountered it. And to me, it really speaks to, I think creativity at its heart is deep play. It's not frivolous play. It's quite serious. It's deep engagement with life, and ultimately, I think that's what all of us are yearning for in whatever form we find it. So to me, that idea of deep play is really falling in love with what we're passionate about and what we're here to do, and becoming so engrossed in it that we lose that sense of self-consciousness and sense of time and that deep absorption.
That's the ticket if you can do that.
Yep. Yep.
It's like basketball players,
exactly.
Everybody, whatever field or creative endeavor you're doing, it's the same thing. It's being in the zone, having the flow. But I love that because it takes away, as you said, it takes away the self-consciousness, which is very, it's hard for writers but if you experience it, if you experience that deep play, then you get more and more familiar with it, I would guess, and I would know from what I'm doing.
And right, yes, of course, and as you learn how to create the conditions which make it much more likely to happen, and that's a lot of what I teach. Like, there actually are sort of things that do stimulate that state, and there are things that tend to shut it down. And once you learn those things, you can actually cultivate that state.
Can you tell us a little bit, a couple of tips about how to get into the state?
Sure. Well, the number one thing that shuts it down is self-criticism, self-judgment, self-doubt. So the first thing is actually to make an agreement with yourself when you're sitting down or standing up to do whatever creative work that you do. When you enter your studio, so to speak, you have to make an agreement with yourself every time to suspend judgment, to not judge the work, and to give yourself permission, as Natalie Goldberg says, to write the worst junk in the world. If you grant yourself that permission, you're much more likely to write something wonderful. So it really is reiterating that, coming into some tools to deal with the inner critic and to silence those voices when you're creating. They come back later. That's another story to work with. But in the moment, that is the number one thing, is to silence those voices. I think also sort of small rituals really help. Small rituals that indicate to yourself that you are entering another state. Yes. You are entering the creative state. Is very helpful as well.
That is so helpful, Maxima. Thank you. And so true. And would you talk briefly about Patreon?
Patreon, yeah.
Patreon, sorry.
Yeah. So Patreon is this wonderful, amazing creation that's been around for a while, which is a site that is set up to help artists gather supporters around them, gather their fans, their tribe around them, people who love and want to support their work. And then within that, so I'm on Patreon, patreon.com/Maxima Kahn, and I've been there for a few years now, and it's been absolutely wonderful, because what happens is people who enjoy your work, who believe in your work, join at whatever tier they are comfortable with and wish to join at. My lowest tier is $3 a month, so I say, buy me a cup of coffee once a month. And you get access, you get insider access to that artist's creative life and process, what they choose to share. For me, it's extremely liberating and wonderful as a poet to have somewhere that's behind a paywall where I can share drafts of my poems in progress, and they won't be considered previously published.
Oh, that's terrific.
Right. Yeah, so I do share them there. I share my working methods. I share the ups and downs of my creative career very intimately. So again, because it's behind a paywall, there's a lot more safety. I'm there with folks who want to support me. So it's been incredibly liberating for me. It means I don't have to wait years to share a poem in the world. So that's amazing. And I also work very hard to create rewards for my patrons that are there to also stimulate their creative lives if they want them. So, like, I do a creative theme and prompt every month that I share there, things like that. So I'd certainly love if any listeners want to check it out. There's no obligation. You can do it for a month and quit, or 3 months and quit. You can come and go as you like. So I'd love for anyone who feels so inspired to come check that out. Patreon. Yeah.
Patreon.com, that's patreon.com/Maxima Kahn, Kahn. And you can also find Maxima's blogs at brilliantplayground.com and find out more about her writing at maximacahn.com. Maxima, thank you so much. It's been such a wonderful show. I really appreciate you coming here all the way from California.
It's been a delight.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you, Pamela Moshe Pierce. And thank you all for listening.